Our time of hearing God's word together through sermon, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable unto you, O God, our rock and our redeemer. So, when I think of Pentecost, I'm reminded actually of a line from the Paul Simon song about how these are the days of miracle and wonder. The story that we heard in our first reading today is full of all kinds of incredible things. As the Holy Spirit comes to the least likely of people. Suddenly, these simple fishermen and peasants who have followed Jesus for 3 years and have just been through the most turbulent 2 months of their lives, probably, move from just being simple peasants to becoming prophets of God. The uneducated become the bearers of a great truth. And it's this amazing event, full of fantastic sounding things. And the early summer breeze becomes this mighty rushing wind. Tongues of fire start appearing over people's heads. This isn't just your ordinary day. And I strongly imagine that those early disciples who were just getting together for a meal there probably weren't expecting anything amazing to happen on the day of Pentecost. But it does. The Spirit does come, and nothing is left the same. Of course, some of that expectation of things just going on the way they happen is probably born out of the reality of the turmoil that these early disciples are. Just think about the last 2 months they've probably had. Not even 2 months before this Pentecost day, their leader, Jesus, is captured, put on trial for trumped-up charges, is tortured and is executed in the course of a day. Then, about the time that they're probably starting to come to terms with the fact that he's dead, there comes Easter. He rises from the grave, throwing everything again into the realm of confusion, into this strange, uncomfortable place where the normal seems really far away. For the next 40 days, Jesus keeps making appearances and teaching and shaking things up more. And then not even 2 weeks before Pentecost, which we celebrated last week, Jesus ascends back to heaven to go back to the right hand of God. And now they're just sort of left again. It's like being on a roller coaster. It's up and down and constantly moving and changing. There's no such thing as normality for these guys. There's no such thing as just a routine, a standard day. Everything is in flux. And I think that's a feeling that a lot of us have experienced at points in our lives. That sensation that every time you turn around, it's like somebody just picks up like a box full of stuff and just up into them. Everything goes all over the place, and then it's your job to pick up pieces. It's chaos. And chaos is one of those things that's always kind of been there. Think back, if you will, to actually how the Bible begins. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness covered over the face of the deep. Chaos. It's something that is present in almost every Near Eastern creation story. The Babylonians even thought so much of this chaos that they gave it the name Tiamat and turned her into a goddess who had to be defeated so that their chief god could create the whole universe. And I think for us today, thousands of years after the Babylonians are talking about Tiamat, after the Hebrews are writing about Yahweh creating the earth out of this formless void, I think we still know a thing or two about chaos. What it feels like to be formless, what it feels like to have a void. I think it's a thing that we feel in our moments of pain, in our moments of anguish, when we turn on the news and see war everywhere that we look. When we turn on the news and hear stories of one injustice after another in this world. When we lose people who are dear to us. When we struggle with addictions. When we face all of the dark things that this life has to offer, we look into the face of that chaos. That chaos that just so loves to show off its power in the face of God. That loves to take over our lives and wreak havoc. It's a sensation that, if we're all honest with ourselves, we probably know too well. But today we see this day of Pentecost. That God doesn't just leave us alone in that chaos. That God doesn't just let it run the day. After all, how does the rest of that beginning of the Bible, the very beginning of the story of faith, go? And the Spirit of God was over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Into the darkness, into the chaos, God's Spirit comes. Not to just keep things the way that they were before, but to change them, to create life where there was death, to create hope where there was hopelessness, to create light where before there was only darkness. And the story of Pentecost is just another chapter in the story of God's creation of our lives, of God's creation of this world, of God's creation of the universe. The Holy Spirit comes to be the living presence of Christ among us, to lead us out of death into life, to steer us away from the chaos that so often seems to govern our world, and bring us into something better, to bring us into life that has a purpose, to bring us into a way of being that has meaning, to give us gifts that we can use for the betterment of the world, for the lifting up of each other. See, we get invited to be participants in this creation of the world. Sometimes I think we think that the creation story just ended a long time ago, and now here we are, however many years later. But I think that creation is ultimately the story that we're still living in every day. And as this Holy Spirit comes to us, God's presence living with us, we're invited into that story, not just as passive recipients, but as active participants. As God's grace comes alive for us, as God enlivens our hearts in faith, as God calls us not just to accept things in the world the way they are, but to be a part of the solution to all that is broken and wrong in the world around us. Now, of course, we also can recognize from our text today that that's not necessarily something that happens immediately either. Think about what the Apostle Peter says in this first part of the sermon that we hear at the end of our first reading today. As he quotes the prophet Joel. We hear about your young men and your young women. The Holy Spirit poured out upon you. Your young men will dream dreams. Your old men, or your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. I will pour out my Spirit even on all my servants. And then that's followed up by all this sort of scary sounding talk of changes in the skies and seasons, of smoke and of things like that. Chaos. The Holy Spirit, God's presence in, with, and among us doesn't necessarily change everything immediately. But it's our hope and our strength in the midst of the chaos. It's what empowers us to see past it and see the reality of God's love for us and God's love for all people in all places. It's what gives us our strength to persevere in the face of a world that challenges us, that threatens us, that confronts us with the forces of chaos. And today, we're reminded God says the same things that he said over Jesus in his baptism. You are my child, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. So as we celebrate with him, and those who are close to it, we too are reminded that in our baptisms, the Holy Spirit, the same Spirit that we celebrate today, came to us to dwell with us, to remind us always of God's promises of life, of love, of forgiveness, of hope beyond the brokenness of the world. And so today, we celebrate not just that Tom joins us as our brother in Christ, but that all of us here together in this room are sisters and brothers. That we're all part of something bigger than just ourselves. And that as we figure out what that means as individuals, as families, as a community, we can rest safe in the knowledge that the same presence of God that brings us together, that hovers over these waters of baptism, goes with us out from here everywhere we go, to give us strength, to give us hope, and to nourish us always in God's love.